Well, hi everybody, I'm Bill Whittle and this is The Firewall. You know, we've been told for years and years now that any discussion of Barack Obama's past is somehow off limits, that we need to challenge his policies, not his character. Well, you might be able to make that argument for a senator, but for the commander-in-chief, who must often react in real time to existential threats to the country, who sets the national tone and agenda, and who conducts the nation's foreign policy, well, policies are actually secondary. It's character that really counts. And Barack Obama's character, like your character and mine and everyone else's, is determined by his parents, his upbringing, and by the friends and associations and mentors gathered over a lifetime. And if we don't know the history of the man we've elected to lead our nation, we can't know anything of value about the man himself. Now, Barack Obama, you may be surprised to know, is descended from oilmen and bankers. The president's maternal grandfather, Stanley Dunham, worked on Standard Oil rigs in Kansas during the Depression. The president's biological father, Barack Obama Sr., worked for an oil company, as did his stepfather, Lolo Soetoro. His mother, on the other hand, worked for banks in Indonesia, Pakistan, and elsewhere, and his grandmother, Madeline, who actually raised him, worked as a banker in Seattle and Hawaii. Seems kind of odd that the president would consistently vilify these two trades, greedy oil men and fat cat bankers, whenever he waxes against the excesses of capitalism. Now, Stanley Dunham, Obama's mother's father, had a pretty tough childhood. Barack Obama, writing in Dreams from My Father, describes how Gramps had turned out a bit wild. Some of the neighbors pointed to his mother's suicide. It was Stanley, after all, then only 8 years old, who'd found her body. Just a few lines later, the president adds this about his grandfather. By the age of 15, he'd been thrown out of high school for punching the principal in the nose. For the next 3 years, he lived off of odd jobs, hopping rail cars to Chicago, then California, then back again, dabbling in moonshine, cards, and women. Now, Stanley Dunham married Madeline Lee Payne on May 5, 1940, and Stanley Dunham really wanted a son. So, when Madeline gave birth to a daughter on November 29, 1942, he named her Stanley. Childhood friend Elaine Johnson remembered how the president's mother, Stanley Ann Dunham, introduced herself when they first met. Yeah, I know it's a boy's name, and no, I don't like it. I mean, would you like to be called Stanley? But my dad wanted a boy, and he got me. And the name Stanley made him feel better, I guess. Now, in 1955, Stanley Ann's parents moved to Seattle, Washington. That same year, the chairman of the Mercer Island School Board, Mercer Island is an east side suburb of Seattle, John Stennis by name, testified before the House Un-American Activities Subcommittee that he had been a member of the Communist Party and that there were several Marxist professors on staff at Mercer Island. Now, this may not seem like a big deal today, when no self-respecting university cannot trot out enough Marxist professors to fill a gymnasium pep rally, but in 1955, it came as an utter bombshell to the conservative neighborhood of Mercer Island. And according to the Chicago Tribune, the Dunhams moved to Mercer Island the following year, 1956, specifically so that their daughter could attend the controversial school. Two teachers in particular, Val Faubert and Jim Wichterman, were delighting in teaching a curriculum that it seems safe to say could not be found anywhere else in the country at that time. The rejection of social norms, attacks on Christianity and mainstream culture, and the promotion of the twin 1950s taboos of communism and atheism. The hallway between Faubert and Wichterman's classes was known as Anarchy Alley. I had them read the Communist Manifesto and the parents went nuts, said Wichterman, adding that they would mockingly refer to the parents' protests as mothers' marches. Speaking in 2007, Wichterman remembered the president's mother very well. As much as a high school student can, she'd question anything. What's so good about democracy? What's so good about capitalism? What's wrong with communism? What's good about communism? Said Wichterman. Longtime friend Chip Wall described Stanley Ann, the president's mother, as a fellow traveler. We were liberals before we knew what liberals were. Fellow traveler, of course, is a term first coined by Leon Trotsky in 1924 to describe people who were sympathetic to the Marxist cause. She touted herself as an atheist, and it was something she'd read about and could argue, said Maxine Box, who was Dunham's best friend in high school. She was always challenging and arguing and comparing. She was already thinking about things that the rest of us hadn't. Now, these radical ideas were taking hold in both the parents and the daughter. They shed their Methodist and Baptist upbringing and began attending Sunday services at East Shore Unitarian Church in nearby Bellevue. It was known as the Little Red Church on the Hill for their support of communist causes, especially their advocacy on the part of what was then known as Red China. Oh, and by the way, remember John Stennis, the chairman of the Mercer Island School Board who was outed as a communist? Well, he was also the president of the East Shore Unitarian Church. Now, by the time they moved to Hawaii in 1960, Stanley Ann Dunham was a long, long way away from the hardscrabble, all-American Kansas farm girl that Barack Obama sold her as during the campaign. She was, by many independent, well-sourced accounts, a radical, a Marxist, and an atheist, a rebellious, resentful young woman that everybody knew as Stanley, who was carrying more than one really big chip on her shoulder. Now, let me be as clear on this point as I possibly can be. Of course she has a right to be all of these things. Americans have the right to believe in atheism, Marxism, and all the rest. That's America. But the American people also have a right to know about it. Because when young Barack Obama, searching for his identity, wrote, "I chose my friends carefully, the more politically active black students, the foreign students, the Chicanos, the Marxist professors, and structural feminists and punk rock performance poets," he was following in the intellectual and philosophical shoes of the woman whom he repeatedly described as the greatest single influence on his life. Now, if Barack Obama's maternal grandfather had led a rebellious and unsettled life after discovering his mother's suicide, Hussein Onyango Obama, that'd be the president's paternal grandfather, had it even worse, having been brutally tortured by the British right around the time of the Mau Mau uprising in Kenya, and naturally enough, he never forgave them for it. Hussein Obama died in 1979, by all accounts a bitter, betrayed, and broken man. Barack Obama, in Dreams from My Father, describes in his own words what his grandmother told him about her late husband. What your grandfather respected was strength, discipline. This is also why he rejected the Christian religion, I think. He could not understand such ideas as mercy towards your enemies, or that this man Jesus could wash away a man's sins. To your grandfather, this was foolish sentiment, something to comfort women. And so he converted to Islam. He thought its practices conform more closely to his beliefs. Now, is this relevant? I think it is. As a young man, President Obama consciously chose to reinvent himself, no longer Barry Soetoro, the name that he carried for much of his life, but rather Barack Obama Jr., son of a Kenyan economist. Seems fair to me to ask what kind of a man that was in turn, and what forces had influenced him. Well, in 1959, a Kenyan nationalist leader named Tom Mboya traveled to the United States to raise money to be used to train a new generation of African elites. One of 81 young Kenyans sent to America on the scholarship program was Barack Obama Sr., who was described by fellow scholarship student and current Kenyan journalist Philip Ochieng as charming, generous, and extraordinarily clever. However, Ochieng also remembers the president's father as imperious, cruel, and given to boasting about his brain and his wealth. If by all accounts Hussein Obama, the president's grandfather, had been a devout Muslim, there's very little evidence that his son, Barack Obama Sr., was religious at all. President Obama himself, writing in Time magazine, says, "Although my father had been raised a Muslim, by the time he met my mother, he was a confirmed atheist, thinking religion to be so much superstition." Well, that certainly seemed to match the outlook of young, self-described atheist Anna Dunham, who he met at the University of Hawaii in 1960. The girl from Seattle, whose parents had moved so she could specifically attend the Marxist school and Little Red Church on the Hill in Mercer Island, met the brilliant Marxist economist from Kenya while attending a language class together. They were studying Russian. You can't make this stuff up. Barack Hussein Obama Sr. married Stanley Ann Dunham on February 2, 1961. In Dreams, Obama writes, "How and when the marriage occurred remains a bit murky, a bill of particulars that I've never quite had the courage to explore. There's no record of a real wedding, a cake, a ring, a giving away of the bride. The whole thing seems so fragile in retrospect, so haphazard. And perhaps that's how my grandparents intended it to be, a trial that would pass, just a matter of time, so long as they maintained a stiff upper lip and didn't do anything drastic." Now, if the Dunhams didn't approve of the marriage, Obama Sr.'s father, Hussein Obama, was white hot with rage. As a young man, Obama learned from his mother that Hussein Obama, his paternal grandfather, had written the Dunhams what Anna described as a long, nasty letter saying he didn't want the Obama blood sullied by a white woman. For a young man abandoned by both his mother and father, and who turned to his African heritage in a search for his identity, that must have had quite an effect. Anna did not discover until later that her husband had been married in Kenya in 1954 to Kezia Aoko, and that he had abandoned her and their two children, and that he had not in fact divorced her, but was rather still married to his Kenyan wife at the time of his wedding in Hawaii. Barack Hussein Obama Jr. was born on August 4, 1961, and 15 days later, Ann Dunham registered for night classes for the fall semester in Seattle, Washington, leaving her parents and her new husband 2,600 miles away in Hawaii for reasons that remain unclear. In fact, the entire period between the birth of President Obama in 1961 and the finalized divorce of Barack Obama Sr. and Stanley Ann Dunham seems a little, well, odd. There's no real evidence that they ever lived together as a family, or even lived in the same state for that matter. There are no family photos. Then in 1962, while his still teenage wife and child remained in Seattle, Obama Sr. left Hawaii, having graduated with a bachelor's degree in economics and mathematics, a Phi Beta Kappa, straight A student. He went on to study economics at Harvard University. Ann Dunham filed for divorce, citing grievous mental suffering in January of 1964. Barack Obama Sr. ultimately returned to Kenya, where he married Ruth Nidesand, a Jewish-American teacher he met at Harvard. They had 2 sons before separating in 1973. Obama married a 4th time to Jael Otieno, who is currently living in Atlanta, Georgia. After his return to Kenya, though, Barack Obama Sr. published a paper called Problems Facing Our Socialism in the East Africa Journal in July of 1965, and in it he called for such boilerplate Marxist policies as communal ownership of land and the forced confiscation of privately controlled land, the nationalization of European and Asian-owned enterprises such as hotels, with control being turned over to the local black population. He advocated raising taxes on the rich, even up to 100%. Theoretically, he wrote, there is nothing that can stop the government from taxing 100% of income so long as the people get benefits from the government commensurate with their income, which is taxed. Dreams from my father indeed. Now, in part 2, we'll take a look at the life of young Barack Obama, from his days in Hawaii on to Indonesia, through his college years at Occidental, Columbia, and Harvard, right up until his introduction to politics in Chicago. And if you find any of this surprising or interesting, and I know I did, you can keep messages like this coming, actual journalism, by becoming a citizen producer at declarationentertainment.com. I'm Bill Whittle, and we'll see you next time on The Firewall.